Hello. Thank you for inviting me to join with you in celebrating the 50th anniversary, the Golden Jubilee of the Institute of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warsaw. It is an honor to be with you. What I'm going to be talking about today is what she said, usage-based approaches to language cognition, translation, and interpretation. Who the she in question is, you'll have to wait till the end of the talk to find out. So, usage-based approaches to language. What do I mean by language? Well, I take a basic Saussurean view of language. Language is thought sound, associations between patterns of sound and patterns of thought. They become conventionalized in a speech community. Language allows us to express the meanings that are important to us. What do I think about usage-based approaches? Well, I think Walt Whitman sums that up very nicely. This is from a very long poem, The Song of Myself, from around about the same time. He describes in this poem all of the people in his life, the fisherman, the woodsman, the farmer, the young wife. He describes each of these, and then he says, and these tend inward to me, and I tend outward to them, and such as it is to be one of these, more or less I am, and of these, one and all, I weave the song of myself. And I think what he's describing there is a usage-based view of self, which is that I am the sum of all of the interactions with all of the significant people in my life. That approach works for me at least, for personhood. And I think it works for language too, for the song of myself. Usage-based approaches say that our language competence comes from the sum of all of our meaningful language interactions. My recognition of this was in a paper in 2002, which reviewed 50 years of psycholinguistic research, showing that whatever aspect of language you're interested in, vocabulary, syntactic constructions, phraseology, mappings between print and sound, so the written word and its connections to the spoken word. All of these areas of language are sensitive to usage frequency. Well, if that's the case, it has a really important implication, because where does frequency information come from? It doesn't come from dictionaries or grammar books. It comes from using language. What these frequency effects show, if I process a highly frequent word faster than a less frequent word, then what that must mean is that every episode of processing affects the learner's system, that the system is a conspiracy of all prior related experiences. So each episode of processing affects the learner's system. Learning is usage-based. And what that means for models of acquisition is that if you're thinking about language acquisition and you're ignoring the usage distributions, you're missing something really important. You're missing the evidence from which we acquire our language. And so we should really understand that problem space, the language acquisition environment. It's going to give us important clues about processing. So these are views which are shared by cognitive linguistics, usage-based grammar approaches. We learn constructions, form meaning mappings, conventionalized in the speech community, and therefore entrenched as language knowledge in the learner's mind. These are form, morphological form or syntactic form or lexical form, mappings to interpretations, semantic, pragmatic, or discourse functions. We learn constructions through using language, through engaging in communication. And our creative linguistic competence emerges from the collaboration of all of the memories, of all of the utterances in a learner's entire history of language use, and from the frequency-biased abstraction of regularities within them. Our unconscious learning systems are determining the tendencies in language usage, determining the prototypes, determining the common patterns, thus to develop an abstract set of relevant representations for communicating meanings in sound. These views are shared in cognitive linguistics, functional linguistics, psycholinguistics, corpus linguistics. They entail that you can't sensibly separate grammar from lexis, nor form from meaning, meaning from context, structure from usage. Linguistic competence emerges from the interactions of all of these in language usage. And these are thoughts which I'm going to claim today, and I hope that you agree, are common across applied linguistics. And for the first time for me, thinking about it, I think they're essential to translation studies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick review of 50 years of cognitive psychology and linguistics as I see it to apply to second language acquisition and translation. I'm going to be talking about essentials of a theory of language cognition. I published a paper on this 2 or 3 years ago. So when I started thinking about reading and reading disorders in the 1970s, cognitive psychology was very much trying to do this. It was trying to infer the departments of the mind, the representational systems of the mind. We can't see these. We couldn't see these. We had to do experiments and make inferences which are then testable by subsequent experimentation. And this was the modal model of memory produced by Atkinson and Schifrin, the notion that we have various sensory information stores, that information is recoded to a different representation in short-term memory. Short-term memory representations can be rehearsed, but they can also be consolidated as, again, in a different format, long-term memories. But the job of cognitive psychology, as it saw it then, was to sketch out testable models of the representational systems of the human mind. When I started thinking about second language acquisition in the late 80s, 1990s, the models of language cognition that were current then and which were informing second language acquisition were those based on generative grammar. They were looking for universal grammar. They were looking for the innate principles and parameters preset by evolution, the range of possibilities that are there in human languages, and that could be switched so that these constrained possibilities, when met by language input, would allow the language learner to determine the right grammar for that language, the principles and parameter settings, the syntax that would allow the permissible combination of vocabulary to allow unambiguous interpretation of human sentences. So 1980s, 1990s, models of human cognition, models of universal grammar and linguistic cognition. Paradoxically, at the time, never the twain shall meet. It was held within generative linguistics, that language knowledge is different from all other types of cognition. It was separate. Things have changed. Over the next 50 years, what began with this computational analogy of there is some input, there is cognition, thinking and memory, which determines the relevant action or output, the realization that those outputs changed the world and led to new things to perceive, the cycle of interaction. An important cycle was Neisser's cycle of perception. We glimpse something in the world, it gives us a hypothesis. The hypothesis gives us clues of what to look for in order to confirm it. So there was a perception action cycle. As the experimentation went on, so the models of human cognition sophisticated. This is from the dyslexia days, the deep dyslexia, surface dyslexia days, 1980s, views informed by psycholinguistic experimentation and neuropsychology. This is a model for reading to speech. Reading involves some orthographic visual analysis that allows different routes for recoding and recognition of those lexical units to allow access to meaning, and the conceptual system to allow direct lookup of the phonological representations of those words and ultimately to saying those words aloud. But the route to speech could also be via grapheme phoneme conversion. A well-attested model, the dual route model of reading, which is still pretty much current today. But you can see how from the modal model of memory, we have a much more sophisticated view of the relevant representational system, of the representational systems that are relevant to reading. That led to the recognition that the mappings between these systems are frequency biased, are statistical, that certain combinations of letters do not have unambiguous pronunciations, but some are more probable than others. Indeed, that all stimuli are ambiguous, and that what we need to do is determine the most likely interpretation of that stimulus in this context. It led to statistical, connectionist, probabilistic models of human learning. In turn, the advances in imaging technology has allowed research. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. The probabilistic theories of statistical learning were testable in connectionist models, in parallel distributed processing models, which paid some allegiance to neuronal models of mind, the notion that input processing units are connected by many thousands, millions of neurons via relay stations to output representations, and the weightings, the probabilities are encoded in synaptic strings. And today, models of human cognition are essentially statistical, be it connectionist statistical or Bayesian statistical. There is still this recognition that every stimulus is unambiguous and that we interpret it appropriately as it is informed by our accumulated knowledge across our experience. These networks, these modules and their connections, are now viewed through neural imaging, and what is an abstract representation here, well, we can see how different areas of the brain are involved in, and the pathways that connect them are involved in these different cognitive tasks. That's sort of where we are now, or where we were 20 years ago. But the impetus was still to determine cognition in the head. As I wrote in 2008, good old-fashioned psycholinguistics focused on the learner as an associative network, a mechanistic processor of information, relatively unembodied, unconscious, monologic, unsituated, asocial, uncultured, and untutored. The revolution in the last 30 or 40 years is the revolution of recognizing that cognition is not in the head, that cognition extends beyond the skull and the skin. And what I'm going to do now is pull out some of the main essential recognitions of 4E cognition. The recognition of some important essentials that we have to recognize whenever we're thinking of a cognitive task. I'm going to be talking about these as essentials, and we can summarize them in a handy mnemonic. The notion that it's not just all in the head, that the head talks to the world through our embodiment, through this physical body, which gives us these particular transducers between our cognitive system and the world we live in. The notion that we act out in a world, and that these enactions give us predictable feedbacks. So the world is part of our recurrent cognition. That we are embedded in a social and cultural environment. We are not alone. That we have an extended mind, particularly nowadays, where we are surrounded by artifacts, by papers and books and computers and phones and smartphones that allow us to do what we're doing now, which is to talk thousands of miles apart through the medium of technology. And this technology extends our cognitive systems. I'm going to add two more E's, particularly today thinking about translation and interpretation, but they're there, essential to all human cognition: the importance of emotion and the importance of empathy. Of the only way that we can really communicate is by trying desperately to get inside each other's heads. So these are all essentials of human cognition. The original 4 E's are those. This is all part of a post-Cartesian cognitive science. The notion that cognition isn't bounded in the head, that we are part of distributed cognition, a cognitive ecology. And from our living our lives in that ecology, there emerges representational systems which rationally, optimally tune us to the type of world which we're likely to meet next, based on our past experience. So let's begin with embodied cognition. I love this quotation from Merleau-Ponty: "The body is our general medium for having a world." We don't just have an associative network, but that associative network is part of my embodiment. And that if I want to understand what's happening in the world, I have to interact with the world. And that if I want to interpret the difference between a cause motion verb flick and a cause motion verb shove, then part of that is the motoric memories of shoving, and they're very different from flicking. So we're part of a physical embodiment which enacts with the world. This was championed very much by Eleanor Roche, but within cognitive linguistics, the beginnings of cognitive linguistics by George Lakoff. Lakoff championed embodied cognition, the realization that however much you can have symbolic models of cognition, those symbols have to be grounded. And those symbols are grounded in perceptual symbol systems, perceptuomotor symbol systems, that the symbols are grounded in things that are meaningful to begin with, push and shove and shapes. So symbols are grounded in basic level concepts, concepts which cut across vision and motor, representations of the world, prototypes in the world. The prototype, it's hard to talk about a prototype animal, but it's not hard to imagine a prototype cat or dog or hammer, which has this characteristic shape, but which also has this characteristic action that goes with it. Lakoff talks about basic level concepts. He talks about kinesthetic image schemas, these commonalities across our perceptuomotor experience and our capacity to conjure them up, to form mental images. And these are tuned by our experience of the world, and give us mappings between atomic mappings between language and cognition. Lakoff went on to build extensive models of how we build out from these image level representations, metaphorically and analogically. But what's key about his contribution was the importance of basic level concepts and these perceptuomotor image schemas. What Lakoff did for the categories of the things out there in the world, Langecker did for cognitive grammar. Langecker's project is that all linguistic structures are meaningful, and that we can analyze all aspects of linguistic cognition in cognitive terms, be it prepositions, be it aspects, be it tenses, whatever the linguistic category, we can look to see what it's telling us about important things out there in the world. And that what really interests us in the world are physical relations, are movements, are causes, and that something being above something is very different from something being below something, and we need to be able to communicate that in language. We need to be able to communicate temporal sequences of events. We need to be able to communicate the movement of objects across background space, figure ground separations. And we know that languages do these things in different ways. And so that satellite framed languages operate quite differently in their building of caused motion constructions than verb framed languages. And then we can analyze languages and see the ways in which that particular convention of thought sound operates. These are the beginnings of cognitive linguistics and the importance of these image schemas in the ways in which language works. And here are some key texts and journals which communicate those ideas to us. So the first of the E's is embodied cognition. The second is enactivism. The notion that we work in a particular physical environment, and that when we act in it, it gives us predictable feedback. And that environment can be physical and give us a predictable return bounce of ball, but it can also be social. And we have expectations about how animals operate in that world and cars operate in that world. And we can make predictions from the interaction of our actions in that space. And that over time and over culture, we can we can build those things into our culture and have expectations about how two teams of 11 players will fight it out to win the FA Cup that will draw in thousands of audiences around the world. But they are able to do this because of a lifetime of usage on the soccer field. So action is all important. Many of our cognitive abilities are not closed sports. We're working in an open space, but our actions in particular environments gives us particular feedback. If we think of oral enactivism, and we're interested in language, then think of oral traditions. I did a search yesterday to make this slide. These are some of the top hits from oral tradition, religious services, song, sports fans chanting. We end up in environments where our oral enactivism gives us feedback on this little part of the routine, be it oral traditions, community singing, chanting, poetry, song, be it communal reading and enculturing our children by reading to them and sharing stories over generations now in the written word, sharing the daily news across our part of our culture in the daily news, across books, which can go from time to time to time and communicate our ideas, and encapsulate particular ideas in particular forms of language. I've spent, the linguists, the applied linguists who've most influenced me in recognizing idiomaticity and these language routines. This wonderful paper by Pauli and Sider in 1983, the puzzles for linguistic theory, for generative linguistic theory, are that we have all of this memorized language in our head, conventionalized language, which give us native-like selection and native-like fluency. We can convey our meanings grammatically, but that's not enough. We've got to do it idiomatically. Native speakers are highly idiomatic in their language use. They have thousands of multi-word sequences for communicating particular high currency meanings. And linguistics, cognitive linguistics particularly, is increasingly recognizing the importance of phraseology in language representation and the importance of acquiring relevant phraseology for second language learners. Corpus linguistic techniques are informing both our analysis of language and our analysis of learner language. the applied linguistic community is recognizing that and looking at how we learn these formulaic sequences. Cognitive science is recognizing that these formulaic sequences are highly productive, highly fluent, and that we recognize formulaic language faster than we recognize openly constructed language. And this can be applied in language instruction. So here's a paper that Rita Simpson and I did. It came from that wonderful TALC conference in Lisbon where I first met Agnieszka, and was talking about using corpus techniques to analyze out the high currency formulaic language of academic language rather than the language of the street. And we tried to identify an academic formulas list. And now this is happening in any genre. So you can find the phraseology of people learning the plumbing trade, as Averill Coxhead is doing. But it's important because then once you've done that, you can help learners talk the talk as they are learning to walk the walk. And we can then think about, why is it that we have this phrase at the moment, what she said, and that's current, rather than well put, or here, or a nice turn of phrase. So we've had embodied language, we've had enacted language, embeddedness. The ecological psychologists for a good while now have been telling us ask not what's inside our head, but ask what our head is inside of. It is inside of a cooperative, nurturing family group, societal group, that when a child's associative language network is being exposed to language from another associative language network, those networks are embedded in people who have particular cultures and particular goals to help their group optimize their understanding of the world and how to operate in that cultural world. And we share attention with our conspecifics, and we are trying to use that shared attention to share consciousness, to share goals, and to get results which are wins for the both of us. And as Mike Tomasella has revolutionized our understanding of child language acquisition, so this recognition that language is based on cultural cognition, our shared goals and our shared intentions and our shared attentions in this enacted world where we are embodied with conspecifics who are enacting with us in our interpretation of the world. Within second language acquisition and cognition more generally, this has been much championed quite properly by Vygotsky perspectives. Jim Lantolf, Steve Thorne have done much to inject this into our thinking in language acquisition. Society is our extended mind and body. We are embodied in this rich society. And this leads us to another recognition that our minds, not just inside our head, but are extended, distributed across the members of those groups. The notion of the extended mind, distributed cognition. Hutchins did much to bring this to our attention in looking at distributed cognition to begin with in the airline cockpit, that how a plane is operated is not all within the head of one individual, but within a whole cognitive ecosystem, which means that the plane can still land if this person is taken out or that person is taken out or something unexpected happens. There are checklists and conventionalized routines and ways of interacting across the different members of that social and physical environment when we're interacting with other individuals and other artifacts. And our cognition is informed on a routine basis. How often have you looked at your smartphone today? On a routine basis, by rapid access to this societally extended mind. Andy Clark, Supersizing the Mind, Embodiment, Action, and Cognitive Extension. And the major burden of coupling between the agents in our extended, distributed ecology, cognitive ecology, is carried by language. Verbal language extends the brain into a mind capable of conceptualization. We operate in a language-based economy. So, the extended mind, embeddedness, this is very much part of our current applied linguistics. Yes, we have these associative networks. Yes, they are within our heads, but those heads are part of embodied, enacted, embedded usage environment, and that we have regularly recurring contexts of use and associative learning mechanisms which learn these patterns of thought sound, but they are ubiquitously informed by patterns of interaction in our families, our schools, our neighborhoods, our social organizations, that our social identity informs those selections, that we're brought up in large ideological structures over eons of time. Belief systems, religious values, economic values, that we have particular semiotic resources which extend our mind. These are very much the views which are embedded in, for example, the Douglas Fir paper that came out, probably about 76 in the 76, 78 in the Modern Language Journal. And these are things which I've written about extensively in that Essentials of Language Learning paper. Let me add to that. Let me add two more E's. The first is emotion. The recognition that cognition cannot be separated from emotion. Within applied linguistics, Aneta Pavlenko, Jean-Marc Dewey, the importance of emotions and multilingualism, and increasingly across cognitive studies of language, the recognition that, yes, emotion has its highs and its lows, and that there are certain major dimensions of emotion, both strongly represented at different times in our life and more graduated. But these emotion terms that we use are learnt by association to particular, embodied, enacted, encultured actions. And we are now realizing, this is a paper from Science last year, where a huge cross-linguistic sample of 2,474 languages, looking at how emotion words pattern in those languages and that those language groups, a ginormous big data enterprise, showing, yes, across all languages, there are certain common patterns that come out, the positive emotion extremes, the negative emotion extremes. But actually, as you look within different language groups, so you find different patternings of emotion concepts within those groups, and right the way down to within particular languages. And those languages, those language patterns are unique, and the representations of emotions in those language are particular to particular geographic locales. And work on emotions nowadays encourages the cultural construction of emotions. This new book by Mesquita, How Cultures Create Languages, encouraging us to shift focus towards how people from different cultures do emotions rather than having emotions, that emotions are constructed within our culture, and that we learn them from usage, and that those emotions bias entry and fit into that culture. So we cannot understand the emotions of a particular language or a particular group except by being there. So one final E. That E is empathy. What do we mean by empathy? We're back in that theory of mind stuff, that shared goals and constructions, that understanding another person's perspective, a sort of mimicking of one person's affective state by that of another. The act of constructing for oneself another's mental state. A complex form of psychological inference in which observation, memory, knowledge, and reasoning are combined to yield insights into the thoughts and feelings of others. We're using language and interpersonal interaction to try to understand what the other person's thinking, the other person's feeling. It involves experience sharing, perspectives taking, and empathic concern. And across different actions, different situations involving empathy, we can see those different parts of the brain that are involved in sharing experience and in taking perspective, and in sharing empathic concern for one another. And we can see how different situations, romantic partner support, negotiation, counseling for occupational burnout require different levels of these empathic essentials. So these, I claim, are the essentials of a theory of language cognition. And we've gone from the notion of linguistic constructions, conventionalized in the speech community, constructions at all sorts of levels of mapping, of form and meaning, that are learnt by associative networks in our experience, from usage which has a very particular latent structure, statistical pattern. Some constructions are much more frequent than others. Some meaningful situations are much more frequent than others. Language learns the mappings between those two worlds. That we interpret those constructions in usage through our embodied selves, that we share attention, and attention is all important in what we learn from a particular situation. In the end, we share consciousness, and that is a good interlocutor is somebody who we're in tune with. Social interaction builds shared consciousness. We learn language in a cultural and at times instructional context. This was a slide I'm very happy to reuse. I first used it at the AAAL conference in 2007, looking at interaction in second language acquisition. So these are the essentials of a theory of language cognition. And from these essential E's emerges a linguistic competence. Emergentists believe that simple learning mechanisms operating in and across the human systems for perception, motor action, and cognition, as they're exposed to language data as part of a communicatively rich human social and environment by an organism eager to exploit the functionality of language, suffice to drive the emergence of complex language representations. So there we are, we're in this extended mind, this cultural environment. And yes, we can abduct the learner from that context, and we can put them in a room, and we can tap that isolated mind, and we can see things in that isolated mind, and we can ask them in a psychology lab with nothing else going on other than headphones on and a microphone in front of their face to tell us about where they lived when they were 3, and they can do it. We can ask Proust to tell us about a particular experience, a reminding that comes from eating a madeleine, and it can take over his mind, prompted by that memory, and it can take him back to a time and an experience and the language that came with that experience. And yes, we can say he has language in his head, or language in his body, or language in him. But where it's come from is that history of usage with all of those important essentials in place. What are the implications of this view? I'm going to look at 3 or 4 implications very quickly. Implications for understanding language and its usage. I think there needs to be a broad interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary framework of language as a complex adaptive system. We had a wonderful conference 14 years ago, Language as a Complex Adaptive System, bringing together people who represent a wide variety of disciplines. But the recognition that language emerges from patterns of experience, social interaction, cognitive mechanisms. And this brings together, and they've got to be brought together, different perspectives on first and second language acquisition, historical linguistics, psycholinguistics, language evolution, computational modeling. For second language acquisition, we've got to recognize the cognitive and the social. And here are many perspectives over the last 20 years, which have really driven the social turn in second language acquisition. As Johannes Wagner summarized in 2015, cognition is not understood as information processing, but as organizing embodied interactions between social actors in meaningful ecologies, reflectively being shaped by those situated encounters. The target for many second language learners is not just to speak another language, but to become part of the social and cultural environment in which the language is used. This entails frequent and rich participation in the second language life worlds into which a learner bricolages his or her way. And more usage-based approaches, usage-based perspectives on second language acquisition are focused now on language as the sediment of usage events that are left as acquired linguistic constructions in individual language learners from meaningful interaction. Many of these approaches are now available in summarized in written form. Here are some of mine. A quick introduction to usage-based approaches to second language acquisition. I wrote with Steffi Wolf a few years ago. It's been updated several times. A major enterprise looking at the acquisition of construction grammar in second language learners, first and second language learners, informed by these cognitive and corpus linguistic perspectives with Matt O'Donnell and Uta Rama. The Essentials paper, Language is a Complex Adaptive System, Bilingual Language Cognition is a Complex Adaptive System, is very much current. I've explored these ways of thinking about second language morphology, syntactic constructions, the Douglas Fir group I've talked about, the Robinson and Ellis Cognitive Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition book. You can find lots of my readings, my writings on these ideas at my website. Importance for language learning and instruction. This is going around again. This is communicative language approaches. Nowadays, it's often being talked about as rewilding. We learn our language in these meaningful environments where there are all sorts of cues and affordances for enacting our language and learning from those situated interactions. Steve Thorne is doing a lot of work on using technologies like these to rewild language education. There's a good history of usage-based approaches to cognitive linguistics. There's a good history on task-based language instruction. Some of these texts may not call themselves usage-based approaches, but are very much involved in learning language through meaningful communication. Finally, let me talk about translation studies. And let me confess, I know nothing about translation studies. I have not read anything in translation studies before preparing for this paper. So forgive me. But given the audience, I figured I should try to understand a little bit about translation studies. And I've done what everybody nowadays does with this extended mind, and I've gone and read Wikipedia and one or two small introductions. But what I want to do, just to round up, is to talk through a short and wonderful essay by Zadie Smith. It's entitled Fascinated to Presume, in defense of fiction. She's not talking just about putting words in a language into somebody else's head, but she's interested in putting ideas into somebody else's head and communicating them. She's defending writing fiction about other individuals or other cultures or other groups. And she's saying in this essay, please read it, it's a lovely read. She's saying that, starting from Walt Whitman, that she has in her head the voices of characters joining the ranks of all of the other voices inside her, serving to make the idea of her own voice indistinct. She says, I never believed myself to have a voice entirely separate from the many voices I hear, read, and internalize every day. She starts by quoting Walt Whitman, as I did here. She refers to the particular part of his poem where he asks, do I contradict myself? Yes, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And she doesn't quite like that in our present day environment, our context, where we're worrying very much about containment and our own particular lexical territory being used to take over the world. Land rights, prison ideology, immigration policy, military strategy. We've got to be careful about our language usage and cultural appropriation. And yes, language is a verbal container. That's what we use language for. But as she says, these verbal containers allow the emergence of certain ideas while limiting the possibilities of others. She goes on to move on from Walt Whitman and consider another lovely poem, this time by Emily Dickinson, where she's thinking about her grief and thinking, how can I share my grief with other individuals? How can I imagine other individuals' grief? How can I do it? How can I presume that someone else's grief is a little bit like my own? The fascination of presumption. This presumption, as Zadie Smith says, does not assume it's correct, but with the right sort of level of empathy, I can try really hard to understand that other's point of view, particularly if I've shared experiences with them in their cultures and shared language with them in their cultures. But what's key here is the shared experience and compassion and empathy. She takes from Hector Abad the quotation, compassion is largely a quality of the imagination. It consists of the ability to imagine what we would feel if we were suffering the same situation. People without compassion lack a literary imagination. The capacity great novels give us for putting ourselves in another place. And are incapable of seeing that life has many twists and turns, and that at any moment we could find ourselves in somebody else's shoes, suffering pain, poverty, oppression, injustice, or torture. Zadie Smith is encouraging us that it's really worth trying to understand others and their shared experiences compassionately, and that can give us the language to try to convey those thoughts. I love her essay. I encourage you to read it. It's about fiction, but it's also, I think, highly relevant to interpretation. The fascination to presume assumes, I think, our being there in one language and its culture of use, our usage of another language and its cultural use, and the empathy to use those observations, our memory, our knowledge, and reasoning to a psychological inference based on these representations to yield insights into the thoughts and feelings of others, and to allow us to share those thoughts and feelings in another language, to put words into somebody else's thoughts. So what I've tried to do in this talk, talking in these types of terms, is, I believe, the shared enterprise of what Zadie Smith was trying to do. Like she said. Thank you.